Dr. Sabrina Siegel with the Neuroscience Education Institute, and twice a month, I sit down with a renowned mental health care expert to discuss breakthroughs and best practices for treating patients with mental illness. In this episode of the NEI podcast, we are discussing chronic stress and how to manage chronic stress, especially during this very challenging time when we're starting to approach the holidays, and especially during this very challenging year, the year 2020, when all of us have been enduring the COVID-19 pandemic and the repercussions and the consequences that has placed on us, both individually and as a community. And it is my honor and privilege to interview Dr. Jennifer Love. She is a board-certified psychiatrist. She's also certified in addiction psychiatry and addiction medicine, and she's part of a large group practice in Southern California. Welcome, Dr. Love.
Thank you, Dr. Siegel, for having me. I'm so happy to be talking to my colleagues today. I'm talking to myself today, I feel like it, because I think this year has been the worst for us.
Yeah. I definitely relate to that. And I'm so excited to have you on our show and just have you be able to share this message, this very powerful message with our community as well. So my first question for you is, the global pandemic that we've experienced this year has really taken a toll on so many people. What are the reasons, in your opinion, for this increase in these chronic levels of stress for so many of us?
Okay, so when we look at stress, there's a few different ways of breaking it down. And I talk about this in the book. You have to name the problem. It's first thing is the obvious. And then we go a little bit deeper because the context is more important to each of us than the crisis itself. Wow. So first, we look at the obvious. We have this pandemic. This is new. We've never experienced anything like this in our lifetimes. Our guards were raised, the masks were on, and then it dragged on. Then this global medical crisis became political.
Yes.
And our thoughts were, in my opinion, somewhat intentionally diverted into our belief systems. That's just my opinion. But that created more division, conspiracy theories, and more societal anger. A lot of medical providers even found anger against them. We have been accused of being part of these larger conspiracy theories. And we can talk about more of that later. But there's a very distinct difference between a thought and a belief. And when our thoughts about a medical pandemic or what's going on around us get tied into our belief system, how I vote, what my religion is, etc., then instead of being open to taking in new information, we fight it because we guard our beliefs because they're our everything. So we'll come back to that later. So the obvious is really the pandemic and what it has been to us as healthcare providers. 2020, this has been the best election year ever, right? There has been, it's so contentious, like I can barely even turn on the news. Like I'm just cringing all the time. I'm only watching like international news. We have seen equality tensions. They rose as tightly as probably the 60s. I wasn't around then. But this year, George Floyd's murder was a landmine. This has been an ongoing problem, but this somehow captured more than just his community. It became part of all of us. And we started discussing topics that are really uncomfortable for a lot of us. Things like being not racist versus being anti-racist. And it's very uncomfortable for people who are doing the work, as well as those who are not doing the work. And the tensions in this area are still palpable. We've also had, I live in California, we've had these massive fires. And so we have all of this that's going on, obviously. And so what I do after that is I start excavating just a little bit little by little, because we start uncovering all sorts of little interesting artifacts behind each of these crises and then within ourselves too. So when we look at the pandemic, digging deeper, back to that idea I had before, how our thoughts were manipulated into our belief systems. Mm-hmm. So instead of uniting globally to address this medical crisis, wearing a mask became a political divide, further separating us in our communities, fueling anger on both sides. We've seen an increase in the popularity of conspiracy theories that would typically have been considered fringe, and they no longer are all that fringe. And I think this is particularly challenging and frustrating for the medical community. Many of our colleagues, I'm lucky enough to be working from home, but many people listening to this are literally risking their lives. And many of our patients don't actually believe COVID exists. We've seen a decrease in wearing masks, so increase in lockdowns. Now we're starting to see vaccine conspiracy starting. I could keep digging here deeper and deeper all day long with you, but you can see how it's not just the virus that we're dealing with. When we look at the year's politics, as a country, politics has become a cinderbox. People's opinions and viewpoints are now arrows and bullets. We used to, decades ago, just be able to talk about our viewpoints. And now people feel individually affected, whatever side they're on. They feel their religious rights are being stripped away, or their medical rights, or their gender rights, the equality rights. Everybody is feeling this personally and has been for the last several years. When we dig into the equality tensions, they're just unearthing our internal biases. We all have them one way or another. We are all human, but it's getting ugly. And again, for us on the West Coast with these fires, we have not only things like loss of home, but there's threats from the president of not supporting financially people who have lost their homes, especially in California. It stirs up the global warming debate and then shifts the focus away from this catastrophe and people who have lost their homes in these communities that are suffering onto something else. And if we just excavate a little deeper, we all have our personal stuff too. We are still going through all the stuff in life. For me, my identity was stolen this year, and someone filed my taxes and took my tax return. And
goodness.
The IRS is closed. As a psychiatrist, I've worked more hours than I ever have because my patients are off the rails. There are patients I've known for years who need to be hospitalized, who refuse to go. So I'm running crisis. I'm on call 24/7. And we all have things to deal with. There are those of us who are having divorce. We have kids with special needs. Schools are opening and closing. We still have parents who have cognitive problems. And now we're worried on their health on top of that, and they may have other medical frailties. So when we look at all of what's going on in our lives, and then 2020 has been really, let's face it, it's a parade of horribles, just one right after the other. And then the final excavation, it really goes back to our early life experiences. So if we've been, let's say, bullied as a child or abandoned by a parent, or we lost our home or some of our security growing up, then any of these things that I've mentioned can be an internal trigger. And my favorite saying in my field and also in my life, I say this all the time, is if it's hysterical, it's historical. So I love this because sometimes I feel like I'm just going to burst in this 5-alarm fire and there's maybe a little bit of smoke, but that's about it. If my response to what's going on right now is just totally disproportionate to what's actually going on in this moment, then that's a clue that my brain and my body are responding to all these underlying things as well. So that's why we're stressed. How can
Wow.
we not
Wow.
be? Like,
Yeah.
find me someone who isn't. I dare you.
Yeah, I know. I know. Now, how can someone tell whether they're actually experiencing chronic levels of stress?
This answer is so different for my colleagues than it is for my patients
Mm-hmm.
because we in medicine are so trained from day one. We sublimate, we push things aside, we keep calm and carry on.
Okay.
We are taught how not to freak out at really horrible things.
Wow.
And so, we've all done shifts in the ER. We've all seen these really just things we could never tell our mothers about. And so we are used to like taking that all in. And what happens is our stress just slides from our brains. It has to go somewhere and it gets
Mm-hmm.
into our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
so that's when we start getting all the physical symptoms that I go through in my book: hard time
Mm-hmm.
falling asleep, waking throughout the night, muscle tension, clenching our jaws during sleep, weight gain. Like, I totally have a panda belly right now, I'm embarrassed to say, and I'm working on a little bit of a muffin top. It's awful. But sugar cravings,
Yeah.
we seek distraction. And
Yeah.
so people increase their alcohol intake or video
Yeah.
games or pornography. And so we get caught in things that are less healthy for us, whether phone, games, whatever. We can have a shorter fuse, a lower mood, muscle cramps, dizziness, increased needs for caffeine, low sex drives, like our hormones.
Right.
Everything,
Right.
is affected from head to toe because of our chronic stress. We have to
Yeah.
deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of dealing with it, why would you say that some people seem to be more resistant to chronic stress and some people are more vulnerable to it? What do we know about the risk factors?
Okay. Well, the analogy I'm going to give you is unfortunately going to continue the stereotype that all psychiatrists are a little bit strange. But sometimes, in my defense, I'm much less strange than colleagues. But sometimes I give visuals a lot. I love stories. I read biographies. I do a lot of therapy. So I listen to people's stories and my brain creates these kind of visual memories. So 3 months later, when I'm in therapy with a patient, they say something, I go, hey, wait a minute. And I see the picture and I can fit it back in. And I was
Wow.
sitting with a patient one day who had so much going on. He was so weary. And I said, you know what? I'm just seeing in between us. Sounds super crazy. I understand. Giant yellow bucket. I have no idea why it's yellow. And there's this like pipe above it that comes straight from the universe and it just floods this bucket full of water. And this bucket represents our stress buckets. It's our capacity to deal with stress. We each
Mm-hmm.
have one. And so when that stress bucket is low, we can tolerate more. The universe can just pile it all in and we keep going on. But as we get near the top, once we actually get at the top and we're full, one little drop will put us over the edge. And we
Wow.
have all completely lost it over
Yeah,
that drop. It's
it
very
really is.
confusing for us. It's confusing for the person who handed us the drop. They're like,
Right.
okay, seriously, it's just a tube of toothpaste. Like, the cap's not on. Like, really, that's all. We've all lost it over these really dumb things. But the reality is we do that when the buckets are full.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really, what I told that patient, what I tell my patients today and my colleagues is at the bottom of the bucket, there's this spigot. And so we have to figure out how to turn that on so we can start pulling out the old stuff. The level
Right.
comes down. We make capacity for the new things. But
Ah,
really, the vulnerability to chronic stress, to physical symptoms of chronic stress, depends on how full our bucket is and what our current capacity is for taking on more.
mm-hmm. Do you think that some people aren't very aware of how full their bucket is? I'm curious.
Totally.
Okay.
Totally. We all have varying levels of awareness. So it's helpful to create languages like this, like little
Mm-hmm.
phrases and things so you can say to your partner, like, you never want to say, like,
Yeah.
you know what, you're super stressed. And they're going to be like, no shit, Sherlock. Of course I'm
Yeah.
stressed. You want to learn how to say things like, darling, is your stress bucket full?
Yeah,
We want to kind of create ways of
I
having these
love that.
discussions that are non-judgmental, but we
Yeah,
sometimes are clueless.
yeah. I love that. And I think that's such a great point that you touched on, especially during these times when there's quarantine and families are huddled at home. Knowing not just checking in with yourself about how full your own stress bucket is, but having maybe a verbiage or a language like that where you can talk to each other, and it's almost in a fun way, but it's definitely non-judgmental, where you can check with each other and say, wait, how full is your bucket right now?
Yeah.
That type of thing. And then you have a gauge of knowing where people are at. I love that. That's great.
Yeah.
And speaking of the family dynamic, how has the change in the family structure affected the way that most people will celebrate the holidays this year? And how does it affect the levels of chronic stress that we're experiencing? Because especially this time of year for right now during this pandemic has got to be incredibly challenging. Not seeing loved ones. For some people having lost loved ones this year, I can imagine that this season is going to be very difficult.
There's probably a different answer for each different person who's listening to your podcast, because some people have traditions that they love. Some people are alone. Some people love the holidays. We're a mixed bag in terms of how we view this time of year. But in general, as humans, we've always loved traditions. And we are also wired to dislike or even despise major life disruptions like massive earthquakes or global pandemics or major fires. So regardless of where we're coming into the holidays, there are two mental roads that are ahead of each of us. And one is a road of mourning and feeling the loss, sitting in it. And that, if we sit in that too long, leads to depression, misery, and an exaggerated sense of loss. And I think the key for each of us is going to be the second road, which is practicing resilience. And this is going to be challenging because it takes effort. We have to plan ahead. We have to be more creative. We have to practice what we talk about in dialectical behavior therapy. There's a term called radical acceptance. We have to learn how to create internal joy and let go of the need to have it from traditions. We have to borrow from addiction medicine, we have to accept what we can't change. We have to choose to let go of anger and negativity. And I think planning ahead and thinking of, well, what are some new traditions we can do? Or if I'm alone on the holidays, what are things that I can do to create a sense of community? Whether it's planning an outdoor hot chocolate picnic on Zoom even, and doing things that are really silly, or having a pajama party or whatever it is. Really being creative when we can't be with people in person.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I just want to share something a little anecdotal. I loved seeing all the creative ideas that parents came up with over Halloween for their kids instead of trick-or-treating. And so one example is my sister actually did a little, like a scavenger hunt. She has 2 young children, and they did it in the dark with flashlights all throughout the house to find candy. And I thought, what a great idea. And if there are any silver linings, that's probably part of it, is seeing people's creativity and doing exactly what you just mentioned. And in a way, they're forming these brand new traditions, and some of them might be so joyful that we end up repeating them even after this pandemic is over. So,
well, you gave me this thought that's so brilliant that maybe this season Santa's naughty elves may do the same thing with all the Christmas toys, because they're fed up too. They can't see grandma and grandpa. And so I think that's fabulous. That sounds like fun. I want a scavenger hunt for candy.
I know. It made me think, like, I wish I had that when I was a kid. That sounds so fun.
These days it's find a piece and then go, wait, was that
exactly
before or after I fumigated this house?
Well, we know that the holidays are typically a great source of stress for most people. And so if we were to talk about just the stressful component, like maybe the shopping element, or even just the financial burden of trying to find out how to get presents for people, and that whole emphasis that has been placed on that, making food and those types of things. What's unique about the challenges that we face this year in terms of stress that's related to the holidays during this pandemic?
Yeah, again, different ways of looking at it. And I'm choosing to look at it as less stress. Now, I am not in any way one of those people who hates their family, like those who are like, I can imagine how many people are like, yes, I don't have to see my in-laws, or that weird cousin who voted opposite of me, and we're not going to have to, we get a break from that. And so the pressure to cook for large amounts of people and wrap all these gifts and stuff, we can start focusing on these newer traditions. It's perfectly fine to spend a holiday alone. Years ago, I did my residency and fellowships at University of Hawaii. So there was a year that I didn't even get to go home until my fifth year, because I was always
Wow.
working, and I had ER
Yes.
shifts every year. And so one year, I just had a selfish Christmas. It was like, okay, I'm going to be alone. And it was glorious just to have a day. I went up to the North Shore, and of course the surf was really big, and I got out my camera and did surf photography. And I knew it was going to be different than the rest of my life's Christmases, but I decided that year it would be okay. And so having that selfish Christmas, that idea, that was jokingly what I called it, but it felt like lavish. It was really just the mindset. It easily could have just felt lonely.
Yeah.
My advice to people is, if you've had a loss this year, that's really great. Think about not opening a box of ornaments. Like, the last thing you need if you've had a divorce or a loss or a separation is to go back through memory lane at this vulnerable time. Go to the dollar store and just get new stuff if you're a decorator. Like, go through that box that you have to divide up next year. Like, put a pin in that. Don't do things that are really going to drag you through a breakup or whatever it is.
That's
and to
great
think
advice.
about, yeah, it really is. I know from experience on that one. And to think about, how can we make this just different? Writing letters, like old-fashioned letters to send. Many of us have been just devastated financially. And how fabulous would it be to get an old-fashioned handwritten letter from someone that you care about that's unexpected? And so it brings joy to receive such a thing, but imagine how it feels even to do that, to pick, let's say, 5 old friends from med school or from college, or distant family members or people you haven't been in contact with, to do something special for them that gives them a bit of that unexpected joy this holiday season.
Wow, I love that idea. That's so creative and so unique. And in a way, it's really demonstrating gratitude. And so I could see how it would be really helpful for the person who's writing the letter, but then especially for the person who's receiving it as well, because like you said, that's so unique and so unexpected now.
Right. And it can be a little awkward. I'm not going to lie. I did that once. And it's a couple of my close friends back from med school, and they're like, thanks. Like, they, at first, I think they didn't know how to respond, because we're just so
not used
wired not to do that. We just text. We get on social media and say happy birthday, and that's it. So you make it a bit of a weird response, but I still think it's fun.
Yeah, and I still think in the long run, it would have a positive response, even if it's weird to them at first.
Right.
So you have a very exciting book coming out this January, and it is called When Crisis Strikes. In the book, you share with us 5 steps to heal your brain, body, and life from chronic stress. And these 5 steps is referred to as a 5-step model. Can you share a sneak peek with us about what these different steps involve?
Yes. So this is a really weird time in my life, because I've never written a book like this before. I've never written for the public like that. And I've co-authored the book with a Norwegian clinical neuropsychologist. And so it's really interesting because we wanted to find a way to take what we do in our therapy sessions and make it accessible for people. And
Mhm.
we did this even before 2020 hit. Like the timing of this is just crazy. It's very surreal. But we were thinking about midlife crisis, having kids with special needs, spiritual crises, all these things that kind of started coming up the farther along we get in life. Not that I'm anywhere near middle age, mind you, right? Never will be middle aged. But we thought, how do we take that? I'm not offering tools that other psychiatrists listening don't have. We
Mhm.
took them and we arranged them, and
Mhm.
then we made them more accessible to people who don't speak our language naturally, the language of
Yeah.
therapy.
Mhm.
So we ended up with using these steps based on the 5 fingers. And I'm telling you, we had these huge write on wipe off boards, and it took us quite some time to really get down to these 5 steps. So step one is like the thumb, and it's getting a grip. And that's a
Mhm.
little bit of what we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, right? What is
Right,
the
right.
problem? What's that excavation level underneath? What's the excavation underneath that? To really understand what it is you're dealing with when you're going through a divorce or when you're going through another big life crisis. So the steps don't cure cancer or PTSD or your child's alcoholism, but
Mhm.
they build internal resilience. They
Right, right.
lower the level when the bucket is full. And that is
Yes.
something I think we all need throughout life. And I mean, we actually got a call from the publisher this year, and they said, what do you think about what's going on with COVID? And we ended up writing as a postscript, they added into the first edition,
Oh,
our
that's
COVID
great.
diaries. So we, all vulnerability out there, like, this is my
Wow.
stuff. This is what's happening to me this year. And this is what's getting triggered. And which is
Wow.
crazy. We never,
Amazing.
yeah, I went back and read over that when I got the copy of the book. I'm like, oh crap, did I really just say all that about myself publicly?
But I think that's actually wonderful. There's so much strength in vulnerability. And especially when it comes down to what we're talking about, we're really talking about this time in history where people are
Right.
more vulnerable than ever before for all kinds of mental health consequences. And so for someone
Yeah.
like you to be able to share that and so many people can connect, I just think that's a beautiful thing. That's wonderful. I did not know that this had that. That's great.
Yeah. So I was going to say toward the beginning of the pandemic, but I seriously have lost all sense of time this year. So I don't even remember when this was. Somewhere toward the beginning, my colleagues and I planned to have just like, it was a Sunday evening, like a 15-minute Zoom, because we were really trying to figure out what is our response to transitioning our practices home? How long are we going to
Mhm.
be here? We were trying to coordinate all this, and we thought, let's just have like a 15-minute get together. And we stayed on that Zoom call for 3 hours. And
Wow.
literally, I fell asleep at the end. Someone's like, Jennifer, what do you think of that? And I was like, what? And it's 11 o'clock at night and it's Sunday night. I'm like, I have to go to bed. We needed each other. We needed that
Yeah.
venting. We needed that support. I did a few webinars this year. I started a support group for physicians and therapists
Oh,
who are
that's
dealing with,
wonderful.
yeah, we meet every other Saturday on a Zoom.
Oh, that's
And
great.
I need it too. It's been
Mhm.
all of us are
Mhm.
really affected one way or another.
Yeah. 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 So true. So true. What can you say about the impact of chronic physical illness on chronic stress? Because I know you talk about this in the book.
Well, physical illness and chronic stress, they're both physical, and it's just fire and
Yeah.
fuel.
Yeah.
And chronic physical illness turns on the same alarm systems as we get if you step in front of a bus or you run into a bear hiking.
Right.
And stress control is extraordinarily helpful for our physical well-being. And there are so many studies on this. Our cardiologists know this. Our surgeons know this. There are studies in just about every field.
Mhm.
Cortisol, our initial stress response hormone, gives us an anti-inflammatory boost, right? It helps us Well, it does all sorts of things. It gets fuel into our muscles. It tenses us up to fight the bear, to run from the
Mm-hmm.
bear. But over time, our bodies can't really keep up with chronic stress.
Mm-hmm.
And how our adrenal glands respond changes. So we
Right.
start seeing an increase in inflammation with
Right.
stress, which is horrible if you've had a back injury or you have asthma or some kind of other long-term illness, even hypertension.
Mm-hmm.
We have in our brain the two basal ganglia on the left and the right, and they have to do with the movement,
Mm-hmm.
but also with stress and anxiety management. And so our bodies, the musculoskeletal system is interlocked with the stress system and through the basal ganglia. And so doing things like massage, meditation, yoga, religious practices, whether it's prayer, singing, all of this can decrease chronic stress as well as improve physical well-being. So,
Mm-hmm.
with everything from heart disease, autoimmune disorders, we know that having a traumatic experience can increase either the rate of or the severity of autoimmune disorders. And things like yoga can actually help treat those things.
Yeah.
So, this link between our physical bodies and our emotional sense of well being. Chronic stress is physical. It's hormones. It is neurological. It comes from our brains, the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus. It's all of our hormones together. So it affects us everywhere. Our
Mm-hmm.
insulin regulation, sugar cravings. It's why we gain weight. And so the more stress we have, the more likely we are to have a worsening of our physical symptoms. It's very real connection.
Yeah, that makes sense. That connection between the brain and the body. What are the consequences of, say, a family crisis on chronic stress?
Mm-hmm. We have a whole section on this in the book because it's really crisis by proxy. So,
Okay.
someone you love is going through a crisis. It's not necessarily your crisis, but
Mm.
you are in it because they're in your life. And so if you have a spouse who has a brain injury, if you have a child with special needs or a family member who's using drugs, all of these things affect us. And so we've found that we can use the steps even when it isn't a personal crisis, but we are called to respond to someone else's crisis that affects us. And families can even do the steps together when it's age appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think what you're saying is that sometimes when it comes to things like trauma, we may be it may be something that's not even impacting us directly, but that we may be experiencing a stress response to something that we are experiencing through a loved one, that we are observing, but in essence
Mm-hmm.
experiencing because we are connected to them on
Yeah.
an intimate level. So,
And I
wow,
can
amazing.
give an example in myself a few years ago. I'm very close with my mom and we love cooking together. And she was over, we were cooking and she was asking a little more questions than usual. And I found myself internally feeling pretty snappy. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, why am I so frustrated? Like, I love my mom. She's a fabulous cook. I love like being in the kitchen with her. And what I realized was her asking all these questions was triggering this fear in me because she knows where everything is. She knows where the pots and pans are. She's been in my kitchen a million times. But one of my greatest fears in life is losing her. And
Mm,
so my irritability in that moment was actually rooted in this fear. And so it was coming out with just simple like, okay, well, which pan should I use for this? There's part of me in my brain going, you know what pan, pick a pan. And I reined
yeah.
it in, but it took me a while to figure out. So when these things happen to people we love, it
Hmm.
still affects us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can definitely understand that. So now what about the loss of a loved one? And right now, this is so important, especially this year when so many people have experienced this. How does that impact
This,
our chronic levels of stress?
right. This was one of the toughest sections in the book to write, in my opinion, because we talked about death, we talked about divorce, we talked about having visitation rights with a child sabotaged, we talked about financial devastation. And for me, it hit on some life experiences, especially with death. And I think it becomes particularly challenging around the holidays. And I think it's important to give yourself time to remember, to light a candle and have like a moment to think about that person, but also really be intentional on giving yourself time to be in the current moment, to bring your attentional focus, as my co-author likes to say, to the people in the room. Or you're watching a show with subtitles. You're focusing on paying attention. It gives you a little break from mourning. And it's a practice, but it gives us even a brief break from grief. And some of us have losses in the holidays. A friend of mine years ago, literally, this is one of the worst things that can happen, was carrying the Thanksgiving turkey to the table, and his mother died at the table. And the whole family's there. And it was the worst. And as he got near to that next Thanksgiving, what he did is he actually created a huge community Thanksgiving. And he did it at his church. And there were like 1,000 people or hundreds and hundreds of people showed up, and they coordinated this Thanksgiving buffet. And so, one, he didn't have to be in his house and be triggered to that memory.
Yeah.
And two, he was involved in an act of service. And three, was surrounded by people who knew his story and could just love on him. And so thinking of how we can set up kind of protective barriers for these huge losses that are overwhelming and should be. If you love greatly, you lose greatly. But thinking really creatively, or have someone do it for you, and think creatively of, well, what can my partner do who's just lost his or her parent? Or what can I do to help this friend who's had loss? And thinking about creating pockets to escape that grief, even if it's short, can be very helpful.
Yeah. Wow. That's such a great story too. And I think that's such good advice. And it is something I think that we don't often talk about very much, grief. And it's something that we don't address very much publicly, or it makes people feel uncomfortable to talk about it. So
in our culture, in America, we are so terrified of loss.
Yeah.
Even people who are very religious, many of them, I see them in my practice, are really afraid of loss. And so we don't talk about it. We ignore it. And when it happens to people who are close to us, we don't know how to respond. And there are a lot of people who have spoken up about this. There's YouTube videos. And so if you know someone who's had a loss, you can easily Google like what to say and what not to say to someone who's experienced loss. And those things can be very helpful because it's just not innately a part of our culture for most of us in the United States.
Yeah. How does trauma influence chronic levels of stress? We've talked a little bit about that. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I treat a lot of PTSD, and so it's on my brain a lot. And we have the same responses. But the thing is with trauma, some are external and some are invisible. And it's the invisible ones that are sometimes the hardest to deal with because the people around us don't understand. And this is one of the reasons psychiatry has a stigma, because we can't see depression, but we can see a broken leg.
Yeah.
And so when we can't see it, I tell the story in my book about a man who survived a mass shooting. And everyone kept saying to him, "Oh, thank God you're okay." And all he wanted to do was scream, "I'm not okay." But then he felt guilty for it
Yeah.
because on the surface, he was lucky he had survived. But he was carrying around with him not only the guilt, but this massive amount of anxiety and the trauma of what he had seen. And people just repeatedly downplaying that and telling him how fortunate he was. So trauma is really tricky because it's not only these traumas that occur to us, but again, we look at the context. You and I, Dr. Segal, could go through the same traumatic experience. We could be in the same building when it caught on fire, but have very different responses.
Yeah.
When I took my first written psychiatry board, in psychiatry, we, at the time, were doing a written board and then an oral board.
Mm-hmm.
So I was taking this exam in a high rise with 5 or 6 other people doing the same exam. And our building caught on fire and we had to evacuate during the test. And we all were refusing. They literally came in and shut off our computers. We were not going anywhere. We were like, "No, these are our boards." So we had to go down these stairwells to get outside. And
Yeah.
one of the guys who had done a fellowship and was taking his boards had been in New York on 9/11. And this guy was in a panic. And he's like, "Wait a minute, we shouldn't be evacuating. We need to go up. What if there are people in wheelchairs?" And they're like, "No, the firefighters are here. They've got that covered." But he was just reliving that. And so we were all traumatized. We were only outside of the building 45 minutes. We got back in. We were all traumatized by the event, I think mostly because we learned that the timer doesn't stop on your board exam when your building catches on fire. So we lost this huge chunk of our day on this timed exam.
Gosh.
And yeah, but he had this terror that was worse than we had. We were all afraid. Oh my gosh, there is no way we're passing this board exam, and there is no way I'm ever taking another board exam as long as I live. But for him, he had that level that was even worse. That was hard for us to understand because I was in California on 9/11. And so my experience was very different that day.
Yeah. Wow. That's so powerful. Now, what about an existential crisis? You talk about this in your book as well. If you can go into a little bit more what is meant by an existential crisis, and then how does this impact chronic stress? Because I thought this was fascinating.
Right. So I'm a total nerd and started reading about existentialism. There's the famous writer Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote a famous play called No Exit. And once I read that in school, I became fascinated. And as I'm reaching a certain age, we start thinking about our existence. And so we can have these kind of existential crises. And they're huge because they involve crisis of belief, crisis of sense of purpose. So we see this midlife. How many people of us in medicine have just like over and over, either in residency or later in life, been like, "Oh my gosh, I'm totally going to law school. Like, forget this." Or "I'm going to go be an interior designer. Like, I'm done with medicine." Or people have religious crises. It's the existential problems hit our sense of meaning, purpose, and why we exist, and can devastate us to the core and cause us to question life itself.
Yeah.
In the book, we write about someone who has a midlife affair and has to rethink family. We write about someone who's grappling with the suicide of a spouse and life and death and what that means. And I even write about someone who had a spiritual crisis. And it's really challenging, especially because we all come from these different backgrounds, to understand what it means for people of different faiths to have these different crises. But we go through them, especially people, I think, who make big changes midlife, whether it is in political beliefs or have an awakening, a spiritual belief, a religious experience, or something else. So these are a really big deal because they hit us to the core.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So with that, what is one takeaway that you could share with us that people could put into practice, especially during the holidays and during this challenging time that would help build resiliency and reduce stress?
So I can tell you what I've been doing all of 2020. And there's just a few different things, but it's all about controlling your cortisol. And so the main thing I do is a principle. As I said before, I do a lot of therapy, and I've done a lot of DBT therapy, dialectical behavior therapy for patients. And one of the key components of that I love, and it teaches people who aren't often very adept at practicing mindfulness, practical ways of doing that. And so I use the five senses. You can do this at your home. You can do this at the beach. You can do this walking through the forest. You can do it in your bedroom. You can do it in your closet if you don't have any personal space. You can do it in your office. But I think about my senses and with my eyes, like, what is my eye candy? So one, for me, like clutter, we know studies show that clutter increases our cortisol system and our stress. So I do a 5-minute clean every once in a while. Like when I look around and I'm like, the last thing I want to do is clean. I'm like, no, everything I can do in 5 minutes, go. And it is, I'm not kidding, Dr. Sigal, it is amazing what you can do in 5 minutes. But for me, my eye candy, I like candles. I go to my favorite Instagram pages. I have little fairy lights around my house. So I don't have these big bright lights on. I just have like little soft lights everywhere. I arrange flowers. So I get flowers every week. So it's using your eyes to see things that bring you joy and creating a space for that. And it can be very simple. When you think about sound in your ears, listening to your favorite music, your baby's heartbeat. The other day I was on a Zoom with one of my patients and I said, what is that noise? She said, oh, it's my cat snoring. And we just burst out laughing. Like a cat snoring is just way more enchanting than a human snoring.
Yeah, it's super cute.
Right. So there are these sounds that we can focus on that can just be lovely. When you think about scent, again, candles, aromatherapy. I have a lavender linen spray that I can put on my sheets at night. Cooking spices make me really happy. A cup of tea, which also gets into touch, the warmth of it. A Christmas garland, a favorite perfume or cologne or something. All of these scents can be very calming or remind us of lovely experiences. I look at touch. Again, that warm mug in your hand or fuzzy socks or your favorite flannel, weighted blankets are all the rage right now. Your animal's fur, puppy kisses, having the warmth of a bath or feeling the water of a shower. It's really about focusing on those things, not just doing those things while your brain is wandering off to all the other things.
Right.
With taste, you want to stop and savor your favorite foods and think about the food you're eating. And I'm a foodie, so I love doing this anyway. And I have a few friends who are foodies, so that's easier for some than others. But thinking about your five senses and what are the things that you love and come up with your go-tos and then just start doing them. So it's easy to go to them when you're in times of high stress, but when you practice them regularly, you maintain a better sense of calm on an everyday basis. It's really about what can I do to improve my quality of life on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I love that. Wow, well, that was so great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that amazing information with us. I'm so excited for your book to come out. And thank you for being on our show, Dr. Love.
Thank you so much. I'm terrified personally about my book coming out, but I think that's my own issue. We'll get into that in another podcast. But I want all of my colleagues who are hearing this, we are all in this together. We are part of a community of scientists, whether we're physicians or nurses or whatever we are in this field. We are in this parade of horribles together. And I think it would be helpful for us to support one another, to find the things that bind us together rather than the things that divide us. There are plenty of things that divide us right now, and really work hard to support each other because we aren't getting support from oftentimes our employers or our hospitals or the insurance companies or whatever. And I think we will be much happier if we learn how to support each other in tangible ways. So to give that some thought, I'm going to challenge myself to do that with my physician and healthcare friends. So I encourage everyone listening to do the same.
That's wonderful. I love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Skull. This has been a lot of fun.
This episode has been brought to you by the NEI Podcast. With nearly 100 episodes, you can find us on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Libsyn, and virtually any platform that you prefer to listen to podcasts. If you've enjoyed this episode, we ask that you kindly leave a review for us. Go to any of the platforms mentioned and leave a star rating or a comment. We'd love to hear from you.